My dear child. Today, something hidden beneath silence finally rose to the surface. Your soulmate spoke about you when you were not there to hear it, and for a moment, they stopped protecting themselves from the truth. Their voice changed. Their guard lowered. And then they said something about you that even they may not have realized they were carrying, a truth connected to the one thing they have never been able to forget. But what exactly did they reveal, and why did the person listening suddenly become completely silent? There are confessions that arrive with tears. There are confessions that arrive with trembling hands. And then there are confessions so honest that a person barely recognizes themselves after saying them. That is the kind of moment surrounding your soulmate today. They were not planning to have some deep conversation about you. Your name simply came up. Maybe someone asked an innocent question. Maybe an old memory surfaced. Maybe something reminded them of a chapter they thought they had already placed behind them. But instead of dismissing it, they paused. And that pause said more than an entire speech could have said. Because there are certain names that carry history. Certain names that can make a person remember exactly who they were when they first heard them. Your name may be one of those names for your soulmate. And when they began talking about you, they did something unexpected. They stopped describing what happened between you. And started describing what happened inside them because of you. That difference is everything. They remembered how you made ordinary moments feel meaningful. They remembered conversations that lasted longer than either of you intended. They remembered the way you could look at them and somehow make them feel as though they did not need to hide. But one memory stood above all the others. A moment you may have considered completely ordinary. Yet they remembered it with astonishing clarity. They remembered something you said when they were struggling. You may not even remember saying it. But they remembered. And when they repeated those words today, their voice became softer. Because those words reached a part of them that still needed healing. That is when someone asked the question your soulmate had been hoping nobody would ask. What did that person really mean to you? Silence. Long enough for the answer to become obvious. Your soulmate could have given a simple response. They could have said you were important. They could have said you were special. Instead, they admitted something much deeper. They said you were one of the few people who made them feel understood without requiring them to explain every part of themselves. And then came the confession. They admitted that there were things they never told you because they were afraid you would see just how deeply you had affected them. Think about that for a moment. The silence may not have come from a lack of feeling. It may have come from having too much feeling and not enough courage to express it. Your soulmate had reasons. Some were understandable. Some were mistakes. Some were simply fear wearing the disguise of logic. They told themselves there would be another opportunity. Another conversation. Another moment. Another chance to say what was really in their heart. But time has a strange way of turning later into maybe never. And today, they seem to recognize that. They admitted that there is one thing they wish they could change. Not the entire past. Not every decision. Just one moment when they should have been honest. One moment when they should have looked at you and said what they actually felt. Instead, they stayed quiet. And now that silence has become one of the memories they revisit most often. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Someone asked whether they still believed you mattered to them today. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. They looked down. Then they said something that carried far more emotion than the question required. They said that some people leave your life. But they never completely leave your heart. And then they corrected themselves. They said that wasn't quite right. Because you weren't simply living in their heart as a memory. You had become part of the way they understood love. That sentence changed everything. Because suddenly, this was no longer a conversation about missing someone. It was about transformation. You had changed something in them. Perhaps you taught them to communicate more honestly. Perhaps you showed them what emotional safety felt like. Perhaps you made them realize that being loved is not about being perfect. Whatever the lesson was, they carried it forward. And today, they finally admitted where that lesson began. With you. But there was something else behind their words. Something they almost refused to acknowledge. They wondered whether you ever understood what you meant to them. They wondered if you thought their silence meant they did not care. They wondered if you had interpreted their distance as rejection. And that thought seemed to hurt them. Because if they could speak directly to you right now, there is one thing they would want you to know. Not a promise. Not a dramatic declaration. Something simpler. You were never as insignificant to me as my silence made it look. Those words may be the closest they have ever come to telling you the truth. But the conversation did not end there. Someone noticed the emotion in their voice and asked one final question. If you could tell them anything right now, without fear of how they would respond, what would you say? Your soulmate became completely still. For the first time, there was nowhere left to hide. No excuse. No subject to change. No past to blame. Just the truth. And what they said next was so personal. It revealed a hidden part of their heart they had never intended anyone else to see. But there is a reason they finally said it today. Because something happened earlier that reminded them of you in a way they could not ignore. And that memory did not simply make them miss you. It made them realize something about themselves. Something that may explain why, after all this time, your name still carries a different weight. And that realization is where the deepest part of their confession begins. There was one detail they almost left out. A tiny moment from the past that suddenly became impossible to ignore. Your soulmate remembered a time when you looked at them differently, not with judgment, not with expectation, but with a kind of quiet understanding that made them feel exposed in the safest possible way. They had forgotten how powerful that moment was. Until today. Something brought it back. And when the memory returned, it carried a question they had avoided for a long time. What if they knew what I was really feeling? That question stayed with them. Because perhaps you never saw the struggle happening beneath their calm exterior. Perhaps you only saw the silence. The hesitation. The distance. Maybe you thought they were uncertain about you. But they now realize something uncomfortable. They were uncertain about themselves. They didn't know whether they were capable of receiving the kind of connection you were offering. They didn't know how to respond to someone who could see beyond the version of themselves they showed everyone else. And instead of admitting that, they pulled inward. They became harder to read. They convinced themselves that staying quiet was safer than revealing too much. But today, when they spoke about you, they finally admitted what that silence had actually been protecting. Fear. Not fear of you. Fear of what your presence awakened inside them. Because you made them question things they had been comfortable avoiding. What do I really want? Who do I trust? What does real emotional closeness feel like? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all. Why does this person matter to me so much? Your soulmate may have spent a long time trying to find an ordinary explanation. They couldn't. That is why their words today sounded different. They were no longer trying to make the connection smaller. They were finally allowing themselves to admit that it mattered. And then they remembered something you once did. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic. You may not even have thought twice about it. But your soulmate remembered the exact feeling it created. You made them feel valued during a moment when they felt invisible. You gave them patience when they expected criticism. You listened when they expected to be dismissed. And that small act became larger in their memory with every passing year. Today, they finally understood why. Sometimes the smallest kindness reaches the deepest wound. You may have offered something simple. But they received it at a moment when they desperately needed it. That is why they have never been able to reduce you to just someone from the past. You became connected to a moment when they needed to believe they were still worthy of being understood. And now they wonder. Did you ever know? Did you ever realize how much that moment mattered? That question brought another layer of emotion into the conversation. Because your soulmate began talking about the possibility that you may have moved forward without ever knowing the truth. They imagined you living your life. Growing. Changing. Becoming stronger. And for the first time, they considered that perhaps you no longer need an explanation from them. That thought humbled them. Because love is not always about being chosen. Sometimes love is about recognizing what another person gave you. Even if you were too emotionally immature to recognize it at the time. Your soulmate seemed to understand that today. And then something unexpected happened. Someone asked whether they would want to see you again. The question sounded simple. But their reaction wasn't. They didn't immediately say yes. They didn't say no. They took a breath. And then they said, "I don't know what would happen if I saw them." That answer revealed more than they intended. Because underneath it was anticipation, curiosity, nervousness, and a small amount of hope. Not the kind of hope that demands a specific outcome. The kind that whispers, "Maybe there is still something worth understanding." That thought followed them long after the conversation ended. They began imagining what they would say if you were standing in front of them. Would they apologize? Would they explain? Would they tell you they never stopped caring? Would they simply look at you and admit that they were afraid? For a moment, they imagined all of it. And then they realized something. The speech they had created in their mind was unnecessary. Because if they ever truly get the chance to speak with you again, the first thing they want to say is much simpler. "I'm sorry I made you question whether you mattered." Those words carry a different kind of truth. Because perhaps the greatest pain wasn't the distance itself. Perhaps it was the uncertainty. The wondering. The unanswered questions. The feeling that you had to interpret someone's silence without knowing what was happening inside them. And your soulmate now recognizes that. They recognize that silence can create stories. You may have created one story in your mind. They created another. And both stories may have been missing the same thing. The truth. But today, something changed. They finally spoke that truth out loud. And once spoken, it became impossible for them to pretend they hadn't. Still, there was one confession they kept circling around. They could describe your kindness. Your influence. Your presence. Your importance. But they had not yet said the most vulnerable part. They had not yet admitted what they secretly wanted from you. Not possession. Not control. Not some perfect fantasy. Something much more human. They wanted the chance to be understood by you the way you once understood them. And that desire frightened them. Because receiving another chance means accepting that you have the power to say no. It means putting your heart where another person can see it. And your soulmate is finally realizing that this is what you may have done long ago. You took that risk. They didn't. That realization stayed with them. And later, when they were alone, they returned to the same question. What would I tell them if I knew they would listen? This time, their answer came quickly. They would tell you that your presence changed more than you ever knew. They would tell you that some of their strongest memories are connected to moments they once considered ordinary. They would tell you that they carried your words into places you never knew about. And they would tell you something even more surprising. There is a part of them that still wonders whether the story between you was meant to end where it did. Or whether it simply paused because neither of you knew what to say next. That question is still unanswered. But something happened after they admitted it. They began considering a possibility they had refused to consider before. And this time, it wasn't about remembering you. It was about doing something with the truth. Because your soulmate has finally realized that if they remain silent forever, they may never know what your heart would have said in return. And that realization may be the first real step toward the conversation they have been avoiding all this time. Something inside them shifted after the conversation ended. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of shift that happens when a person realizes they can no longer hide behind the version of the story they have been telling themselves. Your soulmate had spent so much time wondering whether you still remembered them. But today, another question became more important. What if I am the one who needs to remember what they gave me? That question opened something unexpected. Instead of focusing on what they lost, they began thinking about what they received. Your patience. Your presence. Your ability to notice what others ignored. And most of all, the way you made them feel that they did not have to earn the right to be understood. That realization touched a deeper place than nostalgia. Because your soulmate began to understand that what they experienced with you was not simply about chemistry or attraction. It was about recognition. You recognized something in them before they were ready to recognize it themselves. And sometimes, being seen before you are ready can feel frightening. It can make a person run. It can make them create distance. It can make them convince themselves that the connection is too complicated. But years later, when the noise becomes quieter, they may finally understand what they were running from. Not you. The truth about themselves. That is what your soulmate began confronting today. They remembered how easy it felt to be honest with you. Then they remembered how quickly they became afraid of that honesty. And suddenly, an old question returned. Why did they pull away from something that felt so real? The answer was not simple. There were circumstances. There were misunderstandings. There were personal struggles. There were moments when neither of you knew what the other was thinking. But beneath all of those explanations was something more human. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of wanting something deeply. Fear that if they admitted how much you mattered, they would have something precious to lose. So they protected themselves. And in doing so, they may have created exactly the distance they were trying to avoid. That realization hurt. But it also brought clarity. Because you cannot change a past decision by endlessly regretting it. You can only decide what you will do differently now. And that is where your soulmate's thoughts began moving. Toward the present. Toward you. They wondered what kind of person you are today. Whether life has changed you. Whether you still carry the same tenderness. Whether you still remember those small moments. And then another thought appeared. Maybe you are stronger now. Maybe you learned to stop waiting for explanations. Maybe you stopped searching for meaning in silence. Maybe you finally chose yourself. That possibility did something to them. It made them realize that if they ever approach you again, they cannot expect the person they left behind to be standing in exactly the same place. You have your own journey. Your own growth. Your own boundaries. Your own heart. And if your soulmate truly wants another chapter, they must approach you with respect for the person you have become. That is a powerful realization. Because real love does not demand that someone remain frozen in time. It honors their growth. It asks, "Can I meet you where you are now?" And today, your soulmate seemed to be asking that question. Not demanding an answer. Just wondering whether the possibility exists. Then something happened that made the thought even more emotional. They remembered the last time they truly felt that you understood them. And suddenly, they realized they had never thanked you. Not properly. Not for the way you listened. Not for the way you believed in them. Not for the moments when your presence made difficult days feel lighter. They had simply assumed there would be time. And that assumption became one of their deepest regrets. Because time is generous. Until suddenly it isn't. This is why their words today carried such emotional weight. They were not simply saying, "I miss you." They were saying, "I understand your value now." And sometimes that realization arrives later than we wish. But late recognition can still be sincere. Your soulmate may now be looking back at certain moments with new eyes. A goodbye that once seemed final. A conversation that ended abruptly. A message that was never answered. A feeling that was never named. All of it looks different when you finally understand what was underneath it. And then came the thought that surprised them most. What if you were waiting for the same honesty they were too afraid to give? That possibility stayed with them. Because perhaps the connection did not disappear. Perhaps it simply became buried beneath assumptions. You assumed one thing. They assumed another. And neither person had enough information to know the truth. But now, your soulmate has begun to understand that assumptions cannot heal what honesty can. They may not know what you would say. They may not know whether you would welcome a conversation. But they finally know what they would say. And that alone is a profound change. Because for the first time, they are not rehearsing excuses. They are rehearsing truth. They would tell you that you mattered. They would tell you that they noticed more than they ever admitted. They would tell you that some memories remained long after they thought they had moved on. And they would tell you that if their silence ever made you feel unimportant, that was never the truth of what they carried inside. But then, a new fear appeared. What if they speak now and discover that you no longer want to hear it? That question stopped them. Because courage does not remove fear. It simply teaches you not to let fear make every decision. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that. And somewhere deep inside, another realization is forming. Perhaps the purpose of finally telling the truth is not to control what happens next. Perhaps it is simply to stop living behind an unanswered question. That is the beginning of emotional freedom. And tonight, your soulmate may be closer to that freedom than ever before. But there is one final piece to this story that has not yet been revealed. Because when they were alone with their thoughts, they remembered something you once said. Something so simple that they barely noticed it at the time. Yet today, those words came back with startling clarity. And suddenly, they understood why you said them. They understood what you were trying to tell them without saying it directly. That memory has become the key to everything. Because your soulmate now suspects that you may have known the truth about their heart long before they were brave enough to admit it. What if the sentence you thought meant almost nothing, was actually the sentence your soulmate carried with them for years? That is the memory that returned today. It was not dramatic. There was no grand confession attached to it. Just a few ordinary words from you, spoken at a moment when neither of you understood how significant they would become. But now your soulmate remembers them differently. They remember the way you said them. The expression on your face. The pause afterward. And suddenly, they understood something they had missed back then. You may have been giving them permission to be honest. But they were too afraid to accept it. That realization hit harder than they expected. Because sometimes we don't lose people because love wasn't there. Sometimes we lose moments because courage wasn't there. And your soulmate is beginning to recognize the difference. They thought about all the times they could have spoken. All the times they could have reached out. All the times they could have simply said, "I care about you more than I know how to explain." Instead, they chose the safer answer. Silence. Distance. Control. But today, those choices no longer feel safe. They feel unfinished. And that word stayed with them. Unfinished. Not necessarily because they believe some perfect romantic ending is guaranteed. But because there are truths they never gave you the opportunity to hear. That matters. Because when a person carries an unsaid truth for long enough, it can become heavier than the truth itself. Your soulmate finally understands that. They realize they have been carrying an entire conversation that never happened. In their mind, they have imagined what you might say. They have imagined your reaction. They have imagined you smiling. They have imagined you asking why they waited so long. They have even imagined you saying nothing at all. And that last possibility scares them the most. Because what if they finally become honest? And you have already made peace with the silence? That is the question sitting between hope and fear. But something inside them has changed. They no longer seem interested in protecting themselves from every possible outcome. They are beginning to understand that emotional honesty is not a guarantee of getting what you want. It is simply the courage to stop pretending you feel something you don't. Or pretending you don't feel something you do. And that distinction has brought them closer to their truth. Their truth is that you mattered. Their truth is that you still crossed their mind. Their truth is that certain memories connected to you still carry emotional weight. And their truth is that there are things they wish they had said differently. But there is another layer. They also recognize that you deserve more than beautiful words. You deserve clarity. You deserve consistency. You deserve actions that match what someone claims to feel. That realization may be the most important thing your soulmate understood today. Because anyone can say, "I miss you." But it takes maturity to say, "I understand how my choices affected you, and I am willing to take responsibility for them." That is a very different kind of confession. And according to the way they spoke today, they are moving closer to it. They are no longer only thinking about their feelings. They are thinking about yours. They wondered whether you felt abandoned. Whether you questioned your worth. Whether their silence made you believe you were asking for too much. And that thought brought emotion into their voice again. Because perhaps the hardest thing for them to accept is that while they were protecting their own heart, you may have been left wondering whether your heart was ever safe with them. That realization can humble a person. And it did. Your soulmate began thinking about what an honest conversation would actually require. No games. No hidden messages. No pretending everything is fine. No expecting you to magically understand what they never explained. Just two people speaking honestly about what happened. And suddenly, the possibility did not seem impossible anymore. It seemed necessary. But before they could fully embrace that thought, they remembered something else. A moment when you were vulnerable. A moment when you trusted them with something personal. They remember how much that trust meant. And they remember what they did afterward. Perhaps they didn't respond the way you deserved. Perhaps they became distant. Perhaps they acted as though it wasn't important. But now they understand. You were not simply sharing information. You were handing them a piece of your heart. And they may not have realized the responsibility that came with receiving it. That realization has changed the way they see you. They no longer see you only as someone they loved. They see you as someone who trusted them. And that makes the regret deeper. Because trust is not something to take lightly. It is something to honor. That is why the truth they spoke today was so emotional. They finally acknowledged that your importance was never measured by how long you stayed. It was measured by what your presence awakened in them. You challenged them to become more honest. More compassionate. More emotionally aware. And even if they resisted that lesson at first, they eventually had to learn it. Now they are looking back and realizing that perhaps you were not sent into their life simply to become part of a romantic story. Perhaps you were part of a transformation. Perhaps you arrived to awaken something they had buried. And whether the future brings another chapter or simply a deeper understanding of the past, the lesson remains. You were meaningful. You were seen. You were remembered. And you mattered more than their silence ever revealed. But then, just when the conversation seemed to be ending, someone asked your soulmate something that brought everything back to the present. They asked, if you could see them tomorrow, what would you want them to know? Your soulmate didn't answer immediately. This time, there was no hesitation caused by confusion. The hesitation came from emotion. Because they knew exactly what they wanted to say. They wanted you to know that they never stopped appreciating the way you made them feel understood. They wanted you to know that they remember more than you think. They wanted you to know that their silence was never a measurement of your worth. And then, they said something even more revealing. They said that if life ever gives them another opportunity to speak with you, they do not want to waste it. That sentence changed the atmosphere completely. Because it was no longer only a reflection on the past. It was a decision about the future. But there was one thing your soulmate still hadn't admitted. The one truth underneath every memory, every regret, every unanswered question. And when they finally allowed themselves to say it, they realized that this was never really about whether they could forget you. It was about whether they were finally brave enough to stop running from what their heart had known all along. And that final truth is the one they have been closest to revealing today. There is a truth a person can carry for years, and still feel nervous the first time they finally say it aloud. For your soulmate, that truth became impossible to keep buried today. They had spent so much time explaining the connection through circumstances, timing, misunderstandings, and distance. But when all those explanations fell away, something simple remained. You mattered. Not because everything between you was perfect. Not because every moment was easy. You mattered because something about knowing you changed the way they understood themselves. And today, they finally stopped trying to make that truth smaller. They remembered the first moments when they realized you were different. It wasn't necessarily one dramatic event. It was a collection of tiny things. The way you listened. The way you remembered details. The way you could sense when something was wrong. The way you could make them feel comfortable without asking them to perform. Those moments accumulated quietly. Until one day, your presence had become something they noticed whenever it wasn't there. And that is when they understood the depth of your impact. Sometimes you don't recognize someone's importance while they're standing beside you. You recognize it when life becomes quiet enough for you to notice what is missing. Your soulmate experienced that realization. But instead of simply saying they missed you, they went deeper. They admitted that they missed the person they were when they felt completely understood. That confession matters. Because it means the connection wasn't only about what you gave them emotionally. It was about what your presence allowed them to discover within themselves. You gave them permission to be softer. To be honest. To admit uncertainty. To stop pretending they had every answer. And perhaps they did not appreciate that gift immediately. But they remember it now. And that memory has become part of their truth. There is something else they finally recognized. They may have spent too much time wondering whether you would ever come back, when the real question was whether they had become the kind of person who could meet you with honesty if you did. That question changed them. Because longing is easy. Responsibility is harder. Anyone can miss someone. It takes maturity to understand why the relationship became complicated and what must be different if two people ever speak again. Your soulmate began thinking about that today. They thought about what they would say. But more importantly, they thought about what they would do differently. They would listen instead of assuming. They would ask instead of guessing. They would speak instead of expecting you to read their silence. And they would no longer hide behind pride when vulnerability is required. That is a different kind of love. A quieter one. A more mature one. And perhaps that is why their confession felt so emotional. They weren't simply admitting that they cared. They were admitting that they had grown. Still, one question remained. What would happen if they finally told you everything? Would you understand? Would you forgive? Would you even want to hear it? They don't know. And that uncertainty is real. But they are beginning to understand something important. The purpose of honesty is not to control another person's response. It is to give both people the dignity of knowing the truth. And so, if the moment ever comes, your soulmate wants to speak without demands. Without pressure. Without expecting you to erase the past. They want to say, "I know I should have told you sooner. I know my silence may have hurt you. I know you deserved clarity. And I hope you understand that your value was never measured by my ability to express it." Those are not perfect words. But they are honest words. And perhaps honesty is exactly what was missing. Then came the deepest realization of all. Your soulmate understood that they had spent years asking whether you still remembered them, when they should have been asking whether they had honored the memory of you. That changed something inside them. Because remembering you is passive. Honoring what you meant is active. It means becoming wiser because of what happened. It means treating future relationships with more honesty. It means refusing to repeat the same emotional patterns. And if life ever brings you together again, it means showing up differently. Not as the person who once hesitated, but as someone who finally understands the value of what was placed in front of them. And perhaps this is why their words today touched such a deep place. They were not simply saying, "I miss you." They were saying, "You changed me." There is a difference between those two statements. Missing someone speaks about absence. Being changed by someone speaks about impact. And your soulmate finally acknowledged the impact. They admitted that certain lessons they learned because of you still guide them. Certain words you spoke still return when they face difficult decisions. Certain memories still remind them to be kinder. More patient. More honest. That is a beautiful kind of legacy. Because it means your presence mattered even beyond the relationship itself. You left something behind. Not a wound. Not a burden. A lesson. And now your soulmate understands that. But there is one final thing you should remember. You do not have to chase this revelation. You do not have to force a conversation. You do not have to interpret every coincidence as a promise. If this connection is meant to become clearer, let clarity come through real communication and consistent action. Your heart deserves something grounded. Something mutual. Something that does not require you to spend every night guessing what another person feels. And perhaps that is the hidden gift inside everything your soulmate said today. Their truth may bring you closer. Or it may simply bring you peace. Either way, you do not lose your worth. You do not become less valuable because someone needed time to recognize it. You were worthy before they understood. You were worthy while they were silent. And you remain worthy regardless of what they choose next. But tonight, somewhere in the quiet after that conversation, your soulmate is left with one final thought. Not about what happened yesterday. Not about what could have been. About tomorrow. They are wondering whether there is still a respectful, honest way to speak to you. Whether there is still a door that can be approached without forcing it open. Whether one simple message could begin a conversation that should have happened long ago. And as they sit with that possibility, they remember your face. They remember your words. They remember the feeling of being understood. And finally, they stop asking whether you mattered. They know you did. The question that remains is much more powerful. If they finally speak their whole truth, will you be ready to hear what their heart has been trying to say all along? Because today was not necessarily the end of the story. It may have been the moment the silence finally began to break. And sometimes, the most important chapter does not begin when two people find each other. It begins when they finally become brave enough to tell the truth.